I think there's so much complementary things that China and U.S. can do together, and the world need that.
Greater interconnectivity, greater exchange, greater communication is how we're going to clarify, even if we don't agree, to clarify what our two countries hope to achieve.
Hi, welcome to a special episode of the Doha Debates podcast, recorded at the Doha Forum. I'm Femi OK, your host, but I will be moderating with a very light touch so the guests can debate directly with each other. The conversation will be respectful, but always well informed. We'll be taking a critical issue and looking at it from different perspectives. And today, China-US relationships is what we will be looking at with guest Dr. Henry Wang, who is the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. Also joined by Matt Duss. He is the executive vice president at the Center for International Policy and former foreign policy advisor to the US Senator Bernie Sanders. Gentlemen, welcome. So let me start with Henry first of all. If you're thinking about China's foreign policy, and what is different from the way that America views foreign policy, how would you characterize it?
Yeah, I think this is a quite interesting topic. And for all we know, China has been pursued an open up and reform policy for the last 46 years. And but in general, China is largely peaceful. You know, they have, for example, over 2,000 years ago, they have built a Great Wall. They basically happy cultivate the agriculture-based economy for thousands of years. In the DNA, they never travel so far away. For example, during the Ming Dynasty, there's a marshal called the Zheng He, has 7 expeditions travel as far as to Africa, but they never stayed anywhere outside China and colonize any place. So I think I would say Chinese policy is they want a peaceful coexistence, respect, and also sovereignty, and of course non-interference, non-invasion, and win-win. So largely that reflects current China foreign policy, and so not engaging any war. And you can see Asia is probably the only continent where here in the Middle East, is there a lot of war happening. But now in Asia, we haven't seen any hot wars in the last 40 years. So I think China, being a key driver of the Asia Pacific, particularly Asian economic miracle, I hope that will continue.
I don't disagree with a lot of that, or really even any of that. Obviously, I don't contest at all that China has a really important, very interesting history, a great tradition to draw on. I would agree certainly that we've seen peace in the Pacific region. That's a credit in part, I think, to China. I think it also, some credit is due to the United States for relationships that it has built. I also think there are some potential roots of conflict in that region based on what could be misunderstandings, what could be tensions, and how China views its role in the region and in the world with how the United States views its role in that region and in the world, because obviously the United States is itself a Pacific country as well. But I do think there are some in the United States right now who have a much more aggressive view of China, or let's say hostile view. They believe very strongly that the government of China sees a role for itself, which is to kind of overtake the United States and eventually rewrite the rules of the global order. That is something, of course, that the Chinese government does not agree with and denies, as we just heard. I think there are others in the United States, and I would kind of put myself in this camp of people who would say, listen, China has its interests. It wants to grow its economy. It wants to create a thriving middle class. It wants to take care of its own security. Sometimes it's going to do that in ways that the United States is concerned about. It's going to have policies internally that concern us, as I think some of the Chinese government's treatment of its people does, I think, concern those of us who prioritize human rights and human freedom. But ultimately, China and the United States have to coexist. We share this planet. We're two of the most powerful and influential countries on the planet. And a lot of the challenges of today are shared challenges, whether we talk about climate, pandemics, inequality, migration, and ultimately, as the two leading and most influential countries in the world, the United States and China have to find a way to deal with these collective challenges in a collective way.
Well, thank you, Matthew. I think I agree with you. You absolutely, U.S. and China being the number one, number two economy in the world, we have more responsibility to work together. Fighting climate changes and of course future AI and digital and climate and of course the pandemic and all the rest and also global south we have to solving their debt problem as well and infrastructure deficit. But I do disagree on that is that China doesn't really wants to take over U.S. I understand in the U.S. there is a bipartisan consensus now that China become had a different system that may take over U.S. Sometime in the future, and then we have a different system that we're going to probably put some threats of the current Bretton Woods system that has been running for 80 years. But I think there's a lot of mistrust, misunderstanding rising out of this. For example, China actually is trying, like to work with U.S., but of course U.S. has imposed a lot of sanctions on China. There's over 1,500 Chinese company on the American entity list, and you know that there's a CHIPS Act that forbidden not only U.S. company but company from South Korea, from Netherlands, from Japan, or even from Taiwan to sell chips to China. And so I think there's probably quite a bit of over worry on the U.S. side. I think that after two administration, which is the first Trump administration, second Biden administration, having all those trade war, tariff war, China is still there, it's still resilient and still developing. I think that at some point in time, the two countries really probably had to find a way to work together. I've been engaged in a dialogue with a number of U.S. Opinion leaders, and for example, I was talking to Joseph Nye. We had several dialogues together. He was telling me, he said, look, in the next, there's a cycle of China-U.S. relation every 20, 25 years, lows and highs, and then probably we're at the lowest point. Maybe we can really level out and uplifting a little bit. And I was also talking to Graham Allison, which is my colleague when I was at Harvard Kennedy School. He was basically recently, we wrote a book together, how to avoid escaping the Hidis trap. So we don't have to destiny, and I think there's probably over worry on the U.S. side. China is going to take over U.S. or China. For example, China's military budget is only a quarter of U.S. But China's speed railway system is equal to the next 10 countries combined. Whereas U.S. military budget is equal to the next 10 countries combined. U.S. was talking about China Navy expanding, but U.S. has over a dozen aircraft carriers. China probably have 2 or 3. Is far from U.S. Scale, and Chinese Navy never traveled to Caribbean or Hawaii or Cuba or Florida, whereas we see the U.S. is sailing through Taiwan Strait and South China Sea many times over. So I think U.S. is probably a little bit over worried about China, and due to the COVID, due to we have a different system, due to we have a too far away, and some worry about China is rising too fast, may take over U.S. So I think we need more dialogue, more communication, and so that we don't really can get rid of some of those misunderstandings.
Well, I couldn't agree more that we need more dialogue, which is, of course, why I'm so happy to be doing this conversation. But yes, going back to something you said, Henry, I don't think it's that there are many Americans who fear that China will take over the U.S. so much as China seeks to sort of rewrite the rules of the global order in a way that will disadvantage the United States. You made reference to the Thucydides trap, which is, of course, an historical example that is often brought up. How does a hegemon, a great power deal with a rising power and some of the distrust and things that China may very well be doing just to achieve its own interest, its own legitimate security goals will be seen as threatening to the United States and vice versa. So yes, absolutely the answer, or at least to kind of try and deal with this tension, is to have more dialogue. Because ultimately it's not just that we need to kind of design a global order in which both China and the United States feel that their interests are represented. It is to design a global order where all countries, as much as possible, feel that their interests are represented. A global order where that is a genuinely rules-based order. Now, this is a saying you hear often from the United States. This U.S. leaders are fond of this term, but far too often, as we've seen just in the very recent past, over the past several years, the rules-based order too often means that the United States gets to write the rules, and it has special rules for its friends, and it applies different rules to its adversaries and others who are kind of seen as outside the circle, and that does enormous damage to the legitimacy of the order. And I think a lot of what we've been seeing, the distrust and the cracks in the kind of post-World War II system, are in part a reflection of that, I'll call it hypocrisy or double standards.
I think it's fascinating, gentlemen, that Henry, you described the US-China relations as having mistrust. And Matt, you said misunderstanding. That's a different level of tension. Misunderstanding is, oh, we just need to get together and talk. Mistrust means that somehow the US doesn't quite feel China is doing the right thing in their foreign policy. Did I get that right? Am I sensing that different way of looking at each other's foreign policy?
I mean, I would say there's some of that, but I would say there's a bit of mistrust and misunderstanding on the part of both countries. Again, both countries are seeking to achieve what they see as their legitimate national interests. And I think the goal is to try to find, I guess, a zone of understanding where even if we're not going to completely agree, we at least agree on some basic rules of the road about how our two countries are going to interact in the global system.
Well, I think I agree with Matthew about the mistrust and misunderstanding, and that's exactly like think tank folks like us, trying to clarify. I think Matthew mentioned about China, probably going to take the U.S. to rewrite the rules. I don't go as far as that. I think the Bretton Woods system, which is 80 years now, of course, the world has grown out of the size and shape of 1944 because China is already almost 20% of global GDP. 35 years ago, 2%, and global South, like BRICS countries, GDP is already larger than the G7 now. So what I think is that China is a strong supporter of WTO and of course WHO and UN. So when the U.S. mentioned about rule-based, China doesn't dispute rule-based, but what rule? If it's UN rule, that's absolutely fine. But if there is no modifier, just a rule-based, but it could be G7 rule or U.S. rule, or Western rule, that was not clearly defined. So, also on the other hand, we see whereas the U.S. now is, for example, during President Trump's first term, he pulling out of a climate accord, pulling out of a WTO appellate body, still paralyzed WTO arbitrating function until today, and also particularly now the philosophy which we see prevail now in the U.S. is make me great again, make American great again, and MAGA. So in that sense, I think that's why China, Global South, and even EU wants to still maintain its global order. Doesn't mean China going to rewrite that. We said, the Bretton Woods system is great, but of course we need to reflect. For example, in the World Bank, IMF, China's share was really low. But I'm glad that China has launched the AIB, which is a global infrastructure bank, where most of the European countries are in it. Japan, except Japan also, and the U.S. So China welcomes U.S. to join that, and so I think in terms of global competition on the global governance, probably sometimes a little bit healthy Olympic style competition is good. Like China launched the Belt and Road Initiative. Then a few years later, U.S. launched the Build Back Better World B3W, and the EU launched the EU Global Gateway, and India launched the Indian Middle East European Corridor. Great. I mean, let's all put some money to work with developing countries, serving the infrastructure deficit. And also, I really think the World Bank and AIB and ADB and many other banks should work together. So I don't think China is going to rock boat of the global governance system as maybe people in the U.S. think China would do that much. I think, of course, incremental improvement, maybe some more share of Chinese in this global say in the World Bank, IMF, which would be fine. And China is willing to welcome U.S. to come to AIIB. So I don't see there's too much difference there. And I really think that if China and the U.S. doesn't work together, then the global governance system, the UN system, the multilateral system, are going to suffer heavily. And that's why you see a rise of BRICS, because the people say we are getting into multipolar world. Then there's no multiple structure to support that. So the global south become one structure. So we do hope U.S. coming back to this multilateralism, and China would love to work with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've been going through a process in the United States when listening to Henry talk about, China's support for kind of these institutions of the global economy that came out of the Bretton Woods system. In the United States, just over the past few years, and this goes to Trump and MAGA, but it also, I spent almost 6 years working for Senator Bernie Sanders, and this has been part of his critique too, is that the global system was actually not working for American workers. And now Trump and Bernie bring these messages in different ways. I think Bernie's is a bit more constructive and less divisive. But at the root, there was a critique of a system that was accruing wealth to a very small elite, that was diminishing and deindustrializing huge parts of the United States. But again, that was a system the United States helped construct. That's, as I've often said, it was not China that deindustrialized the United States. This was a decision made by American multinational corporations with the support of the United States government. But I do think that anger, that discontent, that grievance on the part of American workers and American communities is very real. We need to take it seriously. I don't think that grievance should be directed at the government of China. I think it should be directed at the people who made those decisions and be channeled toward coming up with a new economic system for the United States. That is what we're in the process of doing right now. You had mentioned, Build Back Better, some of the bills that were passed by the Biden administration, which in domestic terms, I think was a fairly successful administration, starting to reinvest in American communities. But I do also understand how some of those decisions to kind of protect American technology, to reinvest in American industry, and the perception that things like semiconductors are not only an economic benefit, they are a very real security concern. I understand how from China's perspective, this is seen as very restrictive. It's seen as an attempt to suppress China's economic growth. And that's the area where I really think the communication that we both agree needs to happen really needs to be amped up. Because it is not the case, in my view, that American workers need to be pitted against China's workers in a kind of zero-sum competition. I think sharing a sense of positive-sum engagement and win-win is going to be very, very critical.
What are you anticipating from US foreign policy in the next, let's say, 5 years? Because we are definitely in a transition period, and the rest of the world is looking at America to see what will happen. Matt, you start.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've seen from Trump, his basic argument, if I can put it just bluntly, is that we've been getting ripped off. This is a grievance argument against American elites, against, but also kind of global elites. The term globalist has become this kind of pejorative, and he tends to do exactly what I just said I would like us not to do, which is point a lot of this ire toward China, as if China is the new big villain. But, he was elected having made a lot of commitments and promises to the American working class. And he's going to be judged on whether he's able to actually deliver for those people he made promises to. I think my concern is when he is unable to deliver. Because, as I said earlier, I think we know what Trump is. He's someone who is committed to a very rapacious, predatory form of capitalism. And when he's unable to actually deliver for the working class, the concern is that he's going to channel that anger toward domestic minorities, disfavored groups, whether they be immigrants, whether they be LGBTQ people, whether they be external villains, in his telling, whether it's, other countries, including China. And that is a concern. So I think it's really important that, the Democrats and other critics of MAGA, show that there is a faction, a powerful faction in the United States that does not agree with the kind of villainization and demonization of other communities, either within the United States or elsewhere in the world, even though we're going to have differences between two countries that we should try to work out diplomatically.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Master just said about domestic situation. I think domestic is sometimes the reflection of the foreign policy. Foreign policy reflect domestic situation. What I think he's absolutely right. I think both China and U.S. has some domestic problem. We all have a hot potato on our hands. China's economy is slowing down, COVID impact, and of course also the pressure from U.S. and Western countries. But I do see also in the U.S. There is a stagnation of the middle class in the last 40-some years. You see 1% of the Wall Street wealth is equal to the 15% of the mass population. So that gap is really big. But on the other hand, the Wall Street is hitting all-time high. All the multinationals making, laughing all the way to the banks, and they have the money put it in offshore. I remember during the first term, President Trump said, I'm going to reduce the tariff. And then Apple announced they're going to, send back 350 billion US dollars to the US continent. And then they make 500 billion a year, 50 billion a year in China. So you can see, I see, if the US company moving their operation to China, elsewhere, and worldwide, and that U.S. workers, actually, a lot of them are being affected, but then there's no physical policy, there's no benefit sending back, there's no social compensation program. It'll be easy to say, okay, China has stolen your lunch and has taken away your job. So it's good for politicians every year, particularly during election, to say that. So I see there's some policy coming up now. OECD has proposed, and G7, G20 has agreed that we should implement a minimum corporate income tax, 15% anywhere. Cayman Islands, Hong Kong, or Singapore, anywhere in the world, you have to pay 15% tax. So the U.S. company, which made a huge money worldwide, can send money back to the U.S. Let's benefit the Middle West and Rust Belt. So the workers there won't get so angry, and then voting all those nationalist, populist government into the position. Whereas China, I think, on the other hand, we can do more investment into the U.S. President-elect Trump said he welcomes Chinese investment EV cars. If you come from Mexico, I'm going to level 100, 200% tariff. But if you're made in America, he welcomes that. So it's great. We have a Fuyao Glass already invest $1 billion US in the US. We could have the KATL, the largest battery producer in the world. President Zheng of the KATL said he's willing to invest in the US. So, just like a situation in the 80s and 90s where Japanese just export, no manufacturing, US was not happy. Now the Japanese has made so many investment, US has really calmed down that kind of criticism. China can do the same and even better than Japanese. And so I think China can help President Biden MAGA objective, make American great again. So I think in that sense, we could have more dialogues. And I really agree with Matthew that we should talk more and have dialogue and then solving those problems peacefully, rather than talking over the space and wolf warrior or harsh criticism on the daily basis from the U.S. government. So there's many things can be done, and I think a place like Doha Forum, Doha debate is good to exchange and compare views.
Yeah, I mean, Henry just mentioned the global minimum corporate tax, which I think was a great initiative. Senator Sanders also proposed a global minimum wage, which is another way to kind of raise civic and support workers around the world. I do think, and I've written this before, that the working class is where democracy is going to be, kind of won or lost. I think defending the right to unionize, the right to organize, for workers to kind of collectively bargain worldwide is, as I see it, should be a shared value. Because again, this is what I was saying before about treating the rights and the prosperity of workers as a positive sum engagement between our two countries, but also globally, I think is absolutely necessary.
What would you both say are the shared values between China and the US?
Well, I think there's many. I mean, the China actually are very grateful for the U.S. for the entrepreneurship. I mean, and also of course this global multilateral rule. I mean, China used to be unilateral. China never joined any world organizations. I mean, now after Deng Xiaoping and President Carter opened and Nixon, opened the China-U.S. relation, China joined U.S.-led system. So it means that China shares U.S. values in many ways in the global system, and also you can see this market value, which is the most important, that flourish in China, entrepreneurial, capitalist, and all those young startups all happening. So there's a lot of attachment to education. I think U.S. has the best universities in the world. China has the best, also sending a lot of best its brains. We have currently still have 300,000 Chinese students studying in the U.S. and cumulatively 5 million already study there. So you can see the traffic between two countries is very heavy, and I would really propose the Chinese government really open the free visa for U.S. China just recently opened a free visa for all EU countries, and 38 of them to come to China 1 month visa free. I would really recommend that why can't we do that for US, for UK and Canada and all the Western countries? So there's many similarities. I think the differences though is there's of course US is founded on the individualism, liberalism, and all those in China because of 5,000 years history. There's more collectivism. There's more, there's no religion in China, so there's Confucius authoritative concept. Have to respect seniors, family, authority. Government is taking care of you from cradle to grave, and so there's a difference on that. But in general, I think this industrial hardship working and entrepreneurialism, market forces are really the common things that China and U.S. enjoy, and I think there's so much complementary things that China and U.S. can do together, and the world need that, and so I don't see why we can't get along.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are quite a few values that our countries share. I had mentioned to Henry earlier that a few months ago I had the opportunity to travel to Beijing for the Zhengshan Security Conference. It's a major security conference that takes place every year, and the theme of this year's conference was peace and stability. And I really was impressed with how many of the speakers, the Chinese government and military speakers, even as they addressed some of the key issues in that region and in the world, they really were leaning into this message of peace and stability. And I think that is something American leaders have spoken about in the past, but it really struck me how we haven't heard that as much. And, it's easy kind of to dismiss those concepts and those words as like, sure, yes, who doesn't want peace and stability? But I mean, we are really talking about, human lives and human security and human flourishing. And I think I could do with American leaders taking this much more seriously and speaking with this in these words in this language a bit more energetically. Um, going to what Henry said about kind of individualism versus collectivism, and certainly respect China's great history, and obviously because of its huge size and because of its traditions, every country is going to have things about its culture that are different, and we should respect those. I do think, this goes back to kind of our Declaration of Independence, which I think didn't just express what I see as American ideas, but ideas for all of humanity, that people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But at the very basic sense, I think people should have the right to have a say in how they are governed. That's not to say that every government will look the same, but people do have a right not to be ruled by people who don't care about them. I think that is something we all should share. I do feel that is a universal value.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think probably I would really hope that one of the things in common is the business actually of both countries. I mean, there's a 70,000 U.S. company, big or small, in China, and then they generate 700 billion revenues a year, and China also enjoys a huge trade with U.S. So I hope that kind of business and economic bond will continue. China can invest more in the U.S., solving this unfair, trade perceived by the U.S. But also on the Taiwan Strait, that President Trump said, okay, Taiwan has stolen chips technology from the U.S. and not paying the insurance protection fee for the U.S. Well, let's have a new Shanghai communique or China-U.S. communique to really redefine U.S.-China relation on the Taiwan Strait. And let's get some peaceful, dividend there, and then really slowing down this rivalry, that position that we both stuck in. We're stuck there right now. So I think I'm glad also yesterday, the day before yesterday, Trump appointed a new U.S. ambassador to China, which is was a CEO of a Reebok for 10 years, lived in Hong Kong and Singapore, knows all the business. And he has Elon Musk has a huge factory in China. When he had a factory in China, he became the richest man in the world. Apple has 90% of the Apple products made in China. There's no national security for that with those products. Tim Cook has a good relation with Trump. Steve Schwarzman was served as his last chairman of the Trump Advisor Business Community. He has a huge investment in China. Also has founded the Schwarzman College in Tsinghua University. So I see, there's some probably rationality will come back, and let's talk business. And if he wants to make a deal, who will be the best deal maker than China? I mean, as the second largest economy. So I'm cautious. I'm optimistic that because of the two terms of a U.S. president in the past 8 years doesn't work. Sanction, trade war, rivalry, is driving things apart. So let's work together for a better future.
Yes, interesting. I mean, Trump, even though he has kind of pushed some really aggressive unilateralism for the United States, and often speaks about kind of the U.S.'s role in the world as if it is owed tribute, which is, just another form of imperialism. That is the way he seems to understand international relations. It's that if you want to be part of the protection racket, you need to pay up. At the same time, he did, on the campaign trail, talk about he wants to promote peace, he wants to end wars. And my own view is like, listen, if he wants to do that, we should support that. That is something we should all support, even though there's a whole bunch of things that Trump had campaigned on and that he wants to do that I really disagree with, and I think a lot of Americans do. If there are situations, he pursues policies that lead to less conflict, we should be prepared to support that because that is in all of our interests. We'll see how that goes. As I said, he made a lot of promises to American workers, but I'm very skeptical that he's going to be able to deliver on those promises. And when that happens, he may seek to displace that anger in ways that actually lead to more conflict rather than less. But we should, prepare for either outcome.
Matt, briefly, what is the biggest misunderstanding that you feel America has about China?
A lot of Americans believe that China's goal is to just supplant the United States as the global hegemon, that it seeks to remake the global order in its own image, according to its own preferences. Now, there's an irony here because the current global order was written largely by the United States in its image, according to its preferences. Not entirely, but let's understand, coming out of World War II, when there was mass devastation across the world, the United States, protected as it is by two huge oceans on either side, was actually in very good shape and took advantage of that. That's not to say this was entirely cynical. I think there were steps that were taken by American leaders and others that were done with the common good in mind. But you cannot discount the very real self-interest that existed there as well. And I think there is an element of projection there. I think there are things that people can point to on the part of leaders from China, Chinese government leaders over the years, who have expressed an interest. It's easy to kind of point to certain statements and certain writings and documents from any country, and you can kind of piece together selectively to tell a story if you want. Others do that about the United States. That's just kind of the nature of this. But I do think, again, to kind of come to a real and clearer understanding of what China's ultimate goal and the role it sees for itself in the world ultimately is, and how that doesn't necessarily have to disadvantage the United States, is important. And it recognizing that, listen, China does have a very legitimate and sizable role to play in helping to set the global agenda. It is just going to take the United States, which has kind of taken as its right to kind of set the rules. That's going to be an adjustment.
Henry, what's the biggest misunderstanding China has about the United States?
Well, there are some people in China, I think, because of those historical reasons. For example, For example, during the China Civil War, U.S. Supported the KMT, basically attacking the communists at that time. And then there's a Korean War that coming to the border of China, U.S. supported on that, and China was fighting back. And then in the 60s, the Vietnam War, which also come to the border of China. So there's some people in China always think that U.S. May still think of this imperialist approach going to sabotage China, or maybe making China crippled, or not really tolerate this system China has. So there's some people like that thinking about that. But also, I would say, it was the U.S.-led global labor system, WTO, that China joined that, and China benefit. So it's a mixed. I think there's some people misunderstand U.S. as an enemy. There always wants to topple China and topple Chinese leadership, and they don't like the style of Chinese meritocracy. Like they always say, oh, you should change your government every 5-10 years. If you're not, you are our enemy. So they don't recognize, because thousands of years China has used the meritocracy. You need authority in China. That's how China was governed, through this kind of style. And the other thing I think I would add a bit of U.S. misunderstanding on China is that U.S. was quite big saying, oh, China going to attack Taiwan 2027. PLA one centennial anniversary, that's the time China going to take, which is not really true, because we live in China. We never heard that kind of a connotation or documents anywhere we saw. So I think across Taiwan Strait, there's a 500,000 marriages. There's 2 million Taiwanese working the mainland. And then there's a Fujian government in adjunct Taiwan already said Taiwanese come to mainland can work free, Medicare, security, everything. So I think economic integration is there, and can peacefully unite it if U.S. is not really think Taiwan is an unsinkable aircraft. So I think there's not misunderstanding, mistrust between the two countries. But I agree, coming to the basic, again, we need a lot of dialogue, a lot of discussion, a lot of communication, and particularly high-level visit. So I hope that Trump get into the office, like he did in the first term, he'll come to China to visit. Let's have more exchanges. If not, he's coming to China year after for the APEC summit, with China going to host that. So I hope with this kind of a high-level visit, and particularly people-to-people exchange, and also if China open the visa for all the U.S. to come, things probably will get better.
Gentlemen, in the final 1 minute of our conversation, of our time together, what resonated the most from your conversation? Matt?
I think just continuing to look for new opportunities for exchange, for dialogue. I think the idea of easing visa access, having gone through the process to go to Beijing very recently myself, I would very much agree with that. We do see an element in the United States right now that is becoming very hostile, not just to the Chinese government, but actually to the presence of Chinese students, to Chinese ownership of certain properties, and I really think that's concerning, because I think greater interconnectivity, greater exchange, greater communication is how we're going to clarify, even if we don't agree, to clarify what our two countries hope to achieve.
Yeah, oh no, I think the American and Chinese were great people. Chinese people felt very thankful for the American who flying tigers, and when China during the Second World War and all those things. But again, I think that as China become the second largest economy, U.S. Some people are thinking China is waiting in the line to take over, but which is not really true. But I think we do need a lot of communication, dialogues, and also people-to-people exchanges. So I hope that we should have some new narrative. Also, one of the fundamental things is that China does have a system different than the U.S. But the U.S. in the past say, okay, you joined the WTO, you didn't become one of us, so we're going to punish you. No, I mean, China joined WTO, China didn't become same as U.S. Because of its all historical, cultural, and geographic reasons. But please accept that. And I think if we actually accept each other, preventing the McCarthyism in the U.S., prevent nationalism politics in China, I think we should really work together, and for the sake of the world. And if U.S. China get together, I mean, Russia war on Ukraine, or Middle East, Gaza, Israel, Palestinian conflict, all those things can be handled easily. if the two greatest power can work together. So I really hope that we can work together for a better future of the mankind.
Gentlemen, thank you for working together for the Doha debates being recorded at the Doha Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you.